which takes us to the item 13, which is the now quarterly reporting on the National Policy Statement on Urban Development Capacity. Got the team there. Thank you. This is item 13. And with Jacques Victor, we have Regan Solomon from, Regan is our team manager, land use and infrastructure, and Chad Hu, who's a growth analyst at REMU, our research unit. Yes, and we have a C that is added, and I think the housing policies. The next report will be February, and Chad is likely to explain the syncing of which quarter so that we can be in closest proximity to the data coming in. So thank you, gentlemen, for your written report. If you could cover off any other matters.
Good morning, councillors. My name is Chad Hu. I would like to present the first official issue of Council's quarterly monitoring report on our urban development activities and outcomes. This report will be updated as Councillor Darby said, on a quarterly basis. Here are some quick facts of this research finding. Majority of residential developments are occurred within our existing urban environment. Single detached housing development are still the preferable type of dwellings. The number of attached developments are growing. The number of consented attached dwellings from January to September 2017 are 1.6 times more than the whole year in 2013. So far, we've got approximately 5,700 dwellings received Code of Compliance certificate between January and September in 2017. Most dwellings are built within 1.5 to 2 years of time. House prices have flatlined, and the current average house prices is sitting at 970,000, and the median house price is at 810,000. People who own multiple houses make up the largest single group of home buyers. This is followed by movers to Auckland and within Auckland, as well as first home buyers. Rental prices have increased. The average rental price for a typical 3-bedroom house is over $550 a week for most suburbs that are within 30 kilometres of the city centre. And over 450 metres squared of floor space have been consented within the business zones, and the estimated value of construction work exceeds $1 billion. A third of them are within our industrial zones. Another third are within the city centres and local centres, and the remaining third are within our general business zones. At this point, we would like to ask the committee to receive this report and circulate among our local board members. And I will be coming back in February to present the second issue of this monitoring report. The reason that the syncing is slightly delayed is because some of our data, especially around building consents data, are issued by Stats New Zealand, and usually there is a 2-month delay. So the data for December will be released at the end of January, so that will give us a bit of time to analyze the data and present the next issue in February. Thank you very much.
Thank you, members. Mayor Goff, would you like to move receipt of this report? It's a key focus of your work.
I'll move that way.
Thank you.
Question too when we come.
And I'll second. So just to clarify, members, there's a lot of data floating around. Stats New Zealand released something, and next thing a real estate company releases something, and then the Real Estate Institute of New Zealand releases something, and it can become a little bit confusing. So we're trying to get it from where the information from reliable sources, and we need to focus there. So just, you've heard from Chad, end of January is the next feed, and will report right on the heels of receiving it. Questions of Chad, Regan, Jacques? I've got Councillor Walker first, then Mayor Goff, then Councillor Quacks.
So my question goes to the relationship of what I see here and the housing crisis report that Phil Twyford has commissioned that's going to be done very soon, and I understand is going to be well informed, and I would imagine that there will be some interaction between that data and that process and what is here. Could you comment on that?
To the extent that, I mean, obviously some of the data sets that we're reporting in here will probably make its way into the bit of analysis that the government is doing, but apart from that I don't know any details specifically about what they're going to look at or not. But, yes.
So in terms of when you report back next, would it be a fair assumption that you'll be taking into account that report? Housing crisis report?
Yeah, assuming that comes out in December.
Which is what they say.
Yeah, which is what they're saying. So there may be some data sets in that may have an Auckland, you can look at it in an Auckland way, and those would be included if it's relevant. Yeah.
Well, I would hope that's the case, Mr. Chair, because it's going to be great if we're well informed. Thank you.
So, if I could just add that, you'll know that we've had quite a strong commitment to work with government to ensure we have single views of the truth and not multi-views. We don't have any sense that's going to change. In fact, I think that it'll only grow. So we are working hard with the government agencies right now to make sure that whatever feeds into all of these reports are common feeds, and the only thing that will change is assumptions that legitimately can be made. So we will continue to try and keep that so that you are getting a single feed.
Thank you. Mayor Goff.
Yeah, we had a report last Friday at a workshop in terms of the overall building consenting dropping 4.5%, I think, over this time this year, third quarter this year compared to third quarter last year. I'm trying to pull those figures. They don't seem to be reflected in your figure 5, and they're certainly not reflected for attached dwellings. But have you got any clarification of that? It goes back to what the chairman was saying, is that we tend to get a hell of a lot of figures and they don't always line up. But the trend that we heard last Friday was that there was a definite fall in consenting. 4.5% was the figure I think Mr. Chairman used. I'm trying to line that figure up with your chart, figure 5. It doesn't seem to reflect the same thing.
Regan, are you
Yeah,
able
sure.
to enlighten us?
Yeah, so, I mean, the figure 5 is obviously by quarter, so assuming, I'm not exactly sure what was reported last time, but that might explain why there is a decline or not. Depends on how you've cut your time period for analysis.
I guess that will take into account the quarters 4, 1 and 2, which on your graph show a decline there compared to the previous 4 quarters. Okay, it's just how you add it up, I guess. But definitely a flattening off and fall in consent, and also according to your average prices, they were lower than what I read in the Herald the other day. Your average and your median prices a fall off there. You said, what, less than $1 million for the average price and 810,000 for the median price. I think the Herald figures last week were talking about 845. So it does get a bit confusing when we get conflicting figures.
Regan, this is what we discussed about these various figures floating around from various sources. Can we just remind us of this source, which source we should be relying upon, and maybe others we should read and watch, but
I think the Herald figures were real estate.
Yeah,
Real Estate Institute of New Zealand figures.
Yeah, so the key difference is the REINZ is all the sales, and the stuff that's in our report is all the transactions, which include non-market ones.
Yeah.
So you're going to get a different figure because the sample's larger.
Okay, so which is the more reliable?
I'd say our one is, yeah, because we've got all the transactions.
Naturally,
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Regan, just to follow up to the Mayor's question there about data that might reflect a month. Why we take quarters and try to read a trend over more than 1 month, can you outline that? I think it's related, if you get an application come in or you get a CC that's signed off for a big development, you're at risk of making it appear like you've succeeded, but maybe you haven't, and vice versa. Can you just maybe just expand on why we're taking quarterly reads as opposed to just small snapshots?
Sure. So I guess there's a bunch of reasons. The first one is just kind of a data management process. There's a lot of things happen in the space of a month. So, and the quarterly is kind of a easy way to report and understand it. It aligns with how people think about time, or some people think about time. The other thing with the monthly stuff is there's a whole lot of variation that occurs in a monthly time period, and what we're trying to do is make sure you don't draw erroneous conclusions from monthly changes. That said, you can still look at the data by month if you want to. It's not saying that you shouldn't. But in order to kind of give a decent long-run view about how things are trending or not, we've taken a reasonably long time period and a reasonably simple reporting period to just keep it understandable, but we can obviously look at it different ways if that's required.
Thank you. Councillor Quacks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to ask you about paragraph number 5. And it seems extraordinary that the dwelling capacity, the enabled feasible capacity, has dropped from 270,000 dwellings.
Sorry, Councillor, are you on the item 14 or item 13?
Oh, 14.
Yeah, you're on 14, Dick, I think.
What am I doing?
The mayor ahead of
We
his time.
always knew you were quite quick, Councillor Quacks.
Well,
but,
yeah, no, I've never been very quick out of the blocks, though.
Not bad,
Silver's pretty good, though.
Okay, I'll hold my question
Have the
till the
first
next
question
one.
next time.
So give the officers a bit of time to think about it.
Don't get past as you're going down that straight.
Just put them on notice.
Back to 13. A question of my own. This is in terms of the average and median. When the average reader might read that at the top of 442, you've got the average price at 973 and the median at 810, and the 810 is gone up on the previous median, yet the average has come down. Do you want to just briefly explain that? Because someone might look at that and say, oh, that's a discrepancy, but it's not.
Yep, sure. So we've made the definitions of mean and median are in the appendices, I believe, as to how that's calculated. But effectively it relates to the distribution of things that happen over a period of time. And so there are two ways of explaining in an sort of in an average sense about what is happening. But they are, the key point there is you need to understand the distribution of what's happening, and this is just a simple statistic to describe that kind of average situation, which,
Okay.
and I guess as the distribution shows, there kind of isn't an average situation. So,
Yes, okay. And the affordability model, that'll be new to many, and this is courtesy of some work that's been undertaken by our chief economist, David Norman. Formerly, it's been the household income to median house price ratio that's been used, and it's been often referenced by other economists and by media. And there's a new affordability model that's been developed by our own chief economist here. I think this is really important, and he has highlighted a disparity here if you rely on that model when you're relying on household incomes that are higher or lower only because of the number of people that are in the household. Do you want to just take this opportunity to explain that new model that's been adopted?
The new SAM model developed by David Norman's team, it is a relative measurement. So it takes the 2000 2006 as a starting point and apply a number of factors to deflate the current household income as well as household price back to the 2006 model. Household numbers is certainly is a significant issue that because of Auckland's house has becoming more unaffordable, so that will be more people living under the same roof. For example, maybe 3 or 4 adults sharing a dwelling or a household, and that will increase the amount of household income. And from his perspective, this is a false measurement because that is not a typical household that we should be income level that we should be used to measure affordability. So with this model, his team has adjusted the household income level back to the normal typical household, that is 2.5 adults under the roof, and reapplied the same formula to calculate an index of how much unaffordable or affordable the current housing price or future housing prices compared to the 2006 level.
So Chad, given that change, the former model, the household income to median price ratio, could actually be underreporting the unaffordability of housing.
That's right.
That's right.
That's correct. Which is even more worrying. Okay, thank you. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. Just looking at the consents for apartments, which has gone higher than it's ever gone in this last couple of quarters. We know there's a credit squeeze for apartments, so we've got the consents. How do we have to then kind of match them off against code of compliance down the line before we can tell whether those consents have been realised or not? Or do we have any other way of doing that other than waiting for the CCC to be signed off?
We are at the moment working closely with our colleagues in the building control department. We've identified a unique code that we can use since new codes been rolling out. So in the future, there will be a way to measure how many building consents has actually been transferred into real dwellings.
Okay, yeah, so because that's one of the issues. In the unitary plan, we've allowed for a lot of it, but the banks have had to send all their money back to Australia. So I think that's one of the issues, isn't it? Where we just want to do this, but how hard it is to realise it is yet to be seen, I guess. And we just hear anecdotal issues of these developments falling over for lack of finance because the banks want 20% return guaranteed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Goff.
Just a question regarding figure 8 on page 441 on code compliance certificates. If you can help me with what that bar graph shows, what it appears to show that in the fourth quarter of 2013, nearly 2/3 of all code of compliance certificates were issued a year after the building consent, yet by the third quarter of 2017, that's dropped to 4%. Is that what it shows, and what's the explanation?
That is a data, I wouldn't say issue, because building control, since the amalgamation, I think we have resetted our timeline in terms of capturing building consent data, and previously a lot of the data in the Manukau City Council space was contracted to a third party. So all that information gets fed back into the system, which resetted the timeline. So that's why we see a huge increase in the consented less than a year, which being issued with CCCs. Whereas in comparison to 2017, that's a reflection of building consents being issued in in the calendar year of 2016, and a lot of them has been built, and CCC has since then been issued to those dwellings.
So what you're telling us is you're not comparing apples and apples there, that they've had a change in the way that it's being done, and there hasn't been a dramatic decline in issuance over recent years?
We do have a footnote, I believe it's pretty hard to read, at the bottom of that page explaining why there is a difference. I think we should be looking at is 2014, 2015, 2016, and then using 2017, the first 3 quarters, as an indicator of seeing what is happening within the region. I think that's a fair comparison of those years, and looking into the future, I hope this trend will keep going.
So what that suggests is that, you know, we work off building consents and say we're issuing 10,000 a year, but if you look at issuance of Code of Compliance certificates, we're actually completing between 6,000 and 7,000 a year, and this would tend to show that it takes a couple of years from the issuing of building consent to the completion of the building. Is that an accurate?
Yeah, so it's to the issuing of the CCC. The thing that we've found is that a whole lot of things obviously don't get CCCs.
Yeah.
Or they get them when they need to sell the house because the debt wasn't signed off.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's our proxy measure for completions, but it's not bulletproof because there are some issues around when and why people get CCCs. So it's not, yeah.
So if you ask the question the other way around, how many people, having been issued with a building consent, then don't act on it within 2 years? Do you have any idea of what that might be? I'm trying to figure out, we've had this discussion at a national level and at a local level, how many units are we actually building a year? And I don't know that's ever been answered to my satisfaction. So what do you go off? Do you go off the building consents and say that's the broad trend for how many houses are starting construction, or do you go off the Code of Compliance certificate?
So I guess you kind of have to go off both, I guess, because you've got to say the building consents represent an intention to do something. Someone's spent the time to get a piece of paper to say, I might want to do this, maybe. Yep. And then the CCCs, you can kind of match them back to say, well, they clearly went through the process and some building works were signed off that were consistent with the consent. So you do have to use kind of the consents are the input and the CCCs are a proxy for the production of, but they're only a proxy. We still don't, the final question of exactly how many houses has been built is open.
Okay, but presumably if you pay quite a lot of money for a building consent, you don't enter into lightly on the basis I might build, and then for most people who get a building consent, they go ahead and build, don't they?
Yep, but that might not show up in the CCCs though.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Wayne Walker?
Yeah, got a few questions. The first one goes partly to the issue that Councillor Quacks was going to raise.
That's in another report.
I know it is. Having said that, when I look at the information that's presented, I don't see any reference to what's available through the unitary plan, the 422,000. I mean, is there a reason why there isn't some commentary around that in terms of land that's potentially available?
Regan?
No, other than we've tried to keep this report focused on housing and business statistics, consistent with what the MPS requires us to do. The issue of land, I guess, is more of a, it's not something that we monitor regularly, so we kind of wouldn't be that much point in putting it into a quarterly report, but it's also kind of not within the scope of how we've thought what this report should do, which is to give a general overview of the Auckland region's housing market. So, yeah.
Okay, through you, Mr. Chair, I guess when I look at page 433 and I see 2.1 land supply, I would assume that we'd be commenting on the overall land supply because that's the context. So I just want to raise that issue. I would have thought that there was a need for that context. The other question I've got just goes to reporting and the necessity, I'd suggest, for us to report on greenfield versus brownfield. because quite obviously that ties to the unitary plan. Is there any reason why we don't show some breakdown around that?
Regan?
Yep. So some of the data sets are broken up in those kinds of categories, and there are a couple of maps in there. There's a slight difference between brownfield versus greenfield. We talk about urban area, but that's kind of a definitional issue. Suffice to say that we can analyse the data in many more ways than we've currently included in the report. So if more analysis is required on specific things, we're happy to do that.
Okay, through you, Mr. Chair, I mean, I understand and I can look at the maps, and I might second guess greenfield and brownfield, but I would suggest most people out there are going to have a real difficulty. It would be incredibly useful to have the numbers, and given that the greenfield-brownfield mix is critical to us in terms of sustainability and a number of things, I'd suggest that it's useful to pick up on that. The other question I've got just goes to reporting around the mix of, and I'm just trying to find it, between it's housing creation. I think I'm just trying to find the right page.
Can we come back to you?
Yeah, I'll just go to the next question then, and that's around the issue of occupancy, which has been raised. We can have all of these houses, but if a significant number of them are unoccupied, which is the case, then that's a pretty significant thing for us.
Identify unoccupied houses.
That's certainly something I know Remu is looking into trying to answer that question, but yeah, Chris is right, it's pretty hard.
Okay.
Final question?
And yeah, the last question just goes to the mix of houses and the new stuff that's coming on, which is based around consents and so on. Are we also taking into account the residential stock that's being taken, the business stock, the commercial stock that's being taken out from conversion to residential? Is that implicit in the figures that we're reporting on?
Regan?
It cuts both ways. We might be creating...
I think Regan's got it. He's thinking.
So I think, Wayne, is the question, if you've got a commercial building and then you decide to turn it into apartments, say, you're creating residential capacity and you're losing business capacity,
Sure.
Is that right?
I mean, my question goes to page 449, 3, business, where we're giving stats on business floor space and then business sites created. I understand that we might be creating some business floor space, but at the same time we're also taking out business space. So are these figures here net, or are they just one part of the equation?
I think it's one part of the equation. The building consent space is quite a distinct separation from of business and residential. The way we measured our dwelling consented in that space, it also included dwelling happening in our business zones, which that may take up a certain area of the business floor space, but at this stage we can't really separate them out. Hopefully with more information that we're getting in the future, we'll be able to provide a clearer picture of this.
So, through you, Mr. Chair, I just want to put that issue on the table because it's massive. The conversion that has occurred in parts of Auckland from commercial to residential is substantial. So when you look at this, I make the assumption that it's net, but it ain't net.
Okay.
And the other question that I've got that goes to this...
I'm going to give you this last question.
Yeah,
we're up to question 6.
No, it's just the last question. Are we also able to comment on the business land that's effectively rural productive land that's being taken out? and that is occurring, for example, in locations like Pukekohe and elsewhere.
Regan, any insight there?
So I think it is possible for us to look at where the sites have been created in relation to zoning, like what zone they've been created on. So that's maybe something we could think about incorporating into the future, giving a little bit more detail.
Thank you. Councillor, can I invite you to send an email to the staff, copy it to me, as to what your key areas of further investigation are? That would be great. Councillor Hulse.
My question was exactly the same as Councillor Walker's. It's trying to understand that net loss in business land and industrial land. I think it's critical.
And agricultural.
Because we are very focused on houses, and that's an important issue. So I'll use my speaking time on this item to say, finally, the grunty figures put together in an articulate and coherent way, and I think it is exceedingly valuable, and you are awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Hulse. They've done well. Councillor Cracks, out of the blocks.
Yeah, I'm on the right agenda item this time. Thanks, Mr. Chair. On page 432, you have a map of the Auckland urban area. Can you tell me, in terms of square kilometres, how large that area is? Do we know what? Can you give me a figure on that?
So if we're taking the CBD as the center, this 30-kilometer radius will total land area. Sorry,
the total land area of this map, what you call the urban area in 2016.
So we could work it out, but not at the moment. But it's easy enough to work out.
Okay. Because my next question is about the population that is within that urban area. Would give us some guide on the population density and how it's grown over a period of time, which gives us an idea of whether the city is becoming a compact city or not. So that would be a very useful piece of information that we should be have some focus on.
So you're interested in the density per square kilometre?
Well,
but
yeah, that's
in particular
because,
areas or overall?
Because, Mr. Chairman, where there's a myth abroad that Auckland is one of the most sparsely populated and most sprawling cities in the world, when, I think that you'll find that this urban area is somewhere around about 530 to 580 square kilometres, and the population within that is about 1.5 million. And so that should give us a good guide to the actual fact that it's we're not a massively sprawling city at all. We're quite a compact city.
Thanks. I mean, just one example, the city centre here did not have a great residential density 10 years ago. Now it's got the highest density in the whole of Auckland, and I think we're approaching 50,000 people living in the city centre, and that's well ahead of forecast. So there is an example of the transformation in density when it's made feasible and the market takes it up. Questions, others, members? Well, look, I think it's moved by the Mayor, seconded by myself. Chad, Regan, you've done a lot of work on this. I think this is the 4th iteration that the Mayor's office has seen, I've seen. You've worked on this really, really hard, and as Councillor Hulse says, it's good to see the numbers coming together and you can read them and not be confused by them. I think in the past we've had a lot of different inputs, but it's been very difficult to understand a lot of the data that's been presented. We'll get this coming through quarterly in the future. Some takeaways that I've noticed here, just in terms of who's buying, and I just forget which slide it's on, but I think it's on, it's on page 445. It's buyer classification under 2.5. In 10 years, or 10, 11 years, It's interesting to see the changes there. There's been a 10% increase in the number of buyers that could probably be in the category of investor buyers owning multiple homes. A 10% increase there, and countering that, there in the first home buyers category, there's been a 20% reduction. And I think they're pretty stark numbers, those. It's good to see some clarity being put on this. I understand you can break this down further, as Councillor Walker has asked for, but I wouldn't like to see us get swamped in all that other detail and not miss the really important numbers. We've got some challenges going forward. I am really encouraged to see the contribution of our chief economist to challenge the former household income to medium price ratio. I think this is a much more accurate means of reading it. That's the serviceability, affordable model that he has worked up, and that gives us a much greater clarity. So members, these reports will come to us quarterly. The next one hopefully will be February, and then quarterly after that. Ordinarily, I've suggested that we don't have information reports at this committee, but if there's any one thing, along with the provision of public transport and attending to the deficit that we have in addressing environmental matters, it is housing.
Here.
So it will come to us here on a quarterly for information, and we can interrogate it further. So thank you, and I'll take contributions from the Deputy Mayor and then Councillor Mike Lee.
So if you indulge me, Mr Chairman, it's really looking beyond this report, which I think is useful and helpful, and thank you, Regan and team, for doing this. But it's, when we have the census data come in, it's about trying to find that one point of truth between council and government. I know we've had this conflict, Regan, before, which one tells the truth and the 5 sets of data we've spoken about before. So with the census, now we have multiple families living in the one house, and I would question whether the census is going to pick that up. And it's very hard for us to pick it up, but how is this work going to help us get to that one point of truth and agreement between Auckland Council and the government?
Regan?
It's a nice easy one for you, Regan.
I wouldn't underestimate the challenge. Yeah, look, I mean, I think obviously when the census comes out, you know, the sort of areas for disagreement probably shrink a little bit because, you know, it's a national statistic. It's collected, it's pretty robust. There are plans to address the, you know, areas where it might be difficult to get answers or whatever. So, you know, I think we kind of, the agreement kind of comes together and it goes apart a little bit, and maybe what we're trying to do is have less, the variations either side are a little bit trying to narrow that crocodile mouth. But it's, you know, certainly the case that, you know, I think from my perspective anyway, we're sort of saying you need to look at the distribution of things like prices and locations and stuff like that, and maybe think about the region in a little bit more with the complexity in which is actually occurring. So I think we're probably, we definitely agreed about the kinds of things, the kinds of statistics we should look at. So I think we're getting closer.
It's promising. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Mike Lee, would you like to close this debate?
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman and members. I have to say I've been calling for a national policy statement on growth and development since I was elected as chairman of the Auckland Regional Council. This is not quite what I had in mind because it's suggestive of a mechanistic growth approach to capacity. However, it is a national policy statement, so it's not entirely members about Auckland. That's one thing to note. The other point to note is that a national policy statement is an instrument of the Resource Management Act, and therefore is obliged to meet the purposes, the principles and purposes of the Act, Section 5, the sustainable management of natural and physical resources. So it's not entirely, despite the title of the policy statement, a mechanistic thing. There are legal issues of sustainability and I guess even moral issues when it comes to the natural environment and impacts on the environment. So greenfields, we have some constraints within the Auckland boundaries in terms of elite productive soils. That's a constraint that in terms of meeting our obligations of sustainable management we have to take into account.
Councillor,
brownfields.
Can I just check with you, are you referring to item 14 or 13 that we're on? We're on the housing report. And I think you might...
National policy statement on urban development capacity.
Yeah, they both have similar headings and it's very easy to get confused.
I've done a quacks.
You and Hey, Mike, at least you and I are on the same page.
You put an arrow on my remarks and point it to the next one.
Do you mind if we pick up your contribution in the next item?
Well, I am talking about the National Policy Statement on Urban Development Capacity.
Yeah, that's on this one.
Yeah.
That's the one you got.
Look, if you'd like to continue, this is particularly on the housing numbers, the housing data in response to that. And I think you were alluding to greenfields, brownfields, which is probably in the next report.
Okay, I'll where you suggest, Mr. Chairman.
You okay with that?
Yep, sure.
Thank you. Any other contributions? I think we'll close it there. All those in favour say aye. Aye. We'll go again. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Regan and Chad, great work.
Well done.
Members, we didn't take a break as I omitted to do. Are we okay to go to the next report and then go to lunch?
Nobody's got anything to say about 14, have they?
You just heard them. Happy to move, Mr. Chair.
You've got two people at least. We'll go to 14. I'll move your second.
Absolutely.
I'll move and Councillor Walker second. Thank you. Thank you. So back with Regan again and Kyle Bulston, who would like to introduce. This is a very technical report. Regan, would you take us through it, please?
Happy to. So I'm not going to go line by line because it's going to get too difficult. But just a few comments from me to start off with. So what the report has the initial residential analysis that's required under the MPS. The business work is still underway, and what we're requesting is that Chris and Bill can sign it off before the 31st of December, and also that we're going to signalling that we're going to be doing some more analysis in the new year. Just in terms of the kind of high-level numbers view, we're sort of suggesting, well, we are suggesting the population growth in terms of household demand is about 350,000 over the medium term. You can think about the modelling in a couple of ways. So the first thing that we've done is we've worked out what does the plan, the current operative and part unitary plan, what does it enable in terms of additional capacity, and there's a range that's in the report there. The million figure, that represents a redevelopment scenario, so you kind of basically wipe the slate blank and start again, so it's pretty nuclear. If you add in the capacity that you can get in your town centres and your mixed zone areas, then that million goes up. The amount of plan enabled capacity that's commercially feasible, so that's the second piece of analysis. That's about 140,000 dwellings in the residential zones in the urban area, and about 146 in the future urban area. So that gives us call it 290-ish. In addition to that, you can add about 20k in the rural area. That's an upper estimate. And you can also put in about another 30,000 for Housing New Zealand. Now, we're confirming the Housing New Zealand figures at the moment. So you add all those numbers up and you're going to get between 290 and 340-ish, give or take. So in the long run, what that means is that you've got 350 demand, you've got a little bit less supply. So effectively, the situation has flipped compared to what we had with the unitary plan. So people will remember 422 is feasible, 400 is demand, supply is higher than demand. We've kind of only just the situation is effectively reversed now. So there are a whole bunch of reasons why that change has occurred, but there are a couple of really key ones, and I just want to quickly touch on those. The first is that the model is not a forecasting tool. It often gets portrayed as such, but it's not. It's a commercial filter. It's a snapshot for a point in time. But what it can do is it can allow us to test policies, which is what we've done in the report, in a way to understand what various things will happen if you change, say, costs. The second point is that we're modelling greenfield areas very differently than what we did as part of the IHP process. The IHP process, we just assumed it was all feasible. Now, luckily we have the brains of Kyle here. He's built a specific model to do the greenfield areas properly, or not properly, differently than we've done before. The planning system is essentially the same under what we've modelled now and what we modelled in the IHP. There are some tweaks, but generally speaking, it's the same. So the changes in feasibility effectively reflect increased development cost inputs in a market where prices are flat. Everyone will have read about that. So building costs have gone up, civil works have gone up, development contributions, that policy is now included in our model. Finance costs are higher, etc., etc., etc. I haven't gone into the detail in the report, but that's conceptually why those changes, why you get differences in feasibility. And probably the last point here is that the key reductions in the urban area effectively relate to apartments, which appear to be more difficult to deliver in today's market than they were in 2016 when the modelling was done. So that's consistent with current narratives around financial risk, higher costs, shortfall of specialist consultants, equipments, labour, etc., etc., etc. The kind of stuff that Linda alluded to before. We've still got a little bit of work to do. We have to rerun the model with the 2017 valuation information. We've got to confirm a couple of key assumptions with people from the Property Council, and we also have to compare demand and supply, which is another task that another team member is doing at the moment. So we've still got a bit of work to do between now and the end of December, but we think we'll get there, and then in the new year we'll do another round of modelling. So happy to answer any questions.
Okay, I might pick up where I interrupted you, Councillor Mike Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'm concerned that given this is a national policy statement and we're dealing with a new political environment, we should take into account that this direction came from the previous government, which was determined to amend Part 2 of RMA, and had at least 2 attempts to do that and failed, thankfully. But there is a non-sustainable assumption running through this, and yet it is a national policy statement under the Resource Management Act, and legally speaking, I think we need to keep that in mind. In terms of the Auckland part of the nation, I'll just mention again that we have certain constraints that we need to take seriously. One is the greenfields limitation regarding productive soils. Now, not all soils are rated as that productive. And then there is the brownfields, which normally one would favour because it would appear to be more sustainable to build within the urban limits, if you like, even while they're still here. However, but there are some constraints there too that we are all of us, much more aware of now since the signing off of the Unitary Plan. The Unitary Plan panel took made little recognition of infrastructure, and that is the combined, much of the prime urban area, brownfields, are on the combined sewerage system, which has been spilling 2.2 million cubic metres of stormwater contaminated by sewage into the harbour, and is a major headache, infrastructure headache for this council, budgetary headache. So I think we need just to bear that in mind when we're toting up the figures, that it may not be as simple as it looks. On the other hand, and I agree with Councillor Quacks's argument that this country doesn't have a huge population compared to other countries, given the area of the country, and we are talking a national policy statement. All the growth doesn't have to be in Auckland. We need to encourage, for instance, necklace development down State Highway 1 and down the main trunk line into the Waikato and into the Bay of Plenty. And I think that would be go well with the aspects of this new Auckland plan that seems to emphasise interregional train links, for instance. So I would just make those points, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Councillor Quacks.
Yeah, look, I think my questions have been...
I've heard this before, mate.
Deja vu all over again.
If you repeat things often enough, you remember.
Councillor Quacks.
Yeah, I think we've sort of now received an answer to my question in terms of what has changed, made this extraordinary change from enabled feasible capacity within the brownfields area of 270 down to 140. And so look, I'm happy with the answer that, or the explanation that was given on that. But I've got to say that one thing that Regan said that does concern me is I don't see any answer to the question of housing affordability when quite clearly demand will outstrip supply. And that's going to continue to be a huge problem for us. Takes me back to the earlier report that we received about the social impact that has on some of our poorest community, and the community that's represented by Councillor Newman, for example. They don't have 2.7 or 2.9 people per household. It can be up to 6 or 7 people per household down there. Many living in extraordinary conditions that none of us here would accept. And all those are as a result of the policy that we've continued blindly to follow for a number of years, and it's not just this council, of course. It's a number of councils, and it's been going on for 20 years, and in those 20 years things have got worse and worse and worse for those people at the bottom of the socio-economic heap, and we appear to be doing nothing to address that. And that is why I'm singing the praises of Phil Twyford, who seems to have grasped the nettle and said that if you want to actually provide more housing at an affordable price, you've actually got to do away with the urban growth limits.
Thank you, Councillor Quacks. I've never heard that before, Mr. Member Henry.
Did say that.
Councillor Walker.
Sure. Just got a question around the feasibility, and that goes to the stated commitment of the government under Kiwi Build to obviously build a whole lot of homes. Is that something that you're factoring in, and associated with that, the commitment on the part of Hobsonville Land Co that are involved with that to do the same? and that commitment around Kiwi Build significantly goes to brownfield areas, Housing New Zealand areas.
Okay. So the short answer is that Housing New Zealand's development program is included as an addition to the calculations that we've done for every other site. So we effectively take Housing New Zealand's own properties out of our calculation and add them back in, and based on what they say that they're going to develop. And in terms of Kiwi Build itself, it's a little bit unclear at this stage exactly how that's going to roll out, but we can use this tool to investigate how they might be able to expend their funds, expertise, promises to buy houses to change the results that we're getting at the moment. So I'll pass any comment on Kiwi Build to Jacques if he's got anything more to say.
No, I don't actually. Kyle covered it.
So I'm just trying to understand that. So are you saying that basically Kiwi Build ain't in there?
It's not on there because we don't know exactly how they're going to roll it out at this stage.
Okay.
So what we've included at the moment is as far as we understand, the current Housing New Zealand program. Kiwi Build is probably going to be quite different. As soon as there is more clarity on that, then that can be included. But as Kyle said, in terms of Crown land and Housing New Zealand land, that does not come into the equation. So we don't model it as we do the other land. We work on what their redevelopment intentions are. So as soon as Kiwi Build is more clear, then that can be fed into the process.
And we'll see a refresh of this?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that Kiwi Build might do, for example, is that they've said that they might try to de-risk some projects by essentially promising to pre-purchase. So that may change, for example, the amount of finance or contingency that
or apartments.
The banks need for apartments, for example. So one of the key reasons that the numbers are quite different from the IHP modelling is effectively apartments have fallen away because of the essentially the financial side and the cost which is increasing for the specialist consultants, builders, materials and equipment to build that kind of thing, which is partly a function of the fact that we changed the unitary plan to allow a whole lot more of that stuff to happen. So a whole lot more of it did, and there's only so much equipment to go around.
Okay, so through you, Mr. Chair, I mean, I would make the observation that it would be useful to have some qualifier in here around the, you know, the Kiwi Build and the like, because it is hugely significant. The other question I've got, just a very quick one, goes to page 9, bullet point that starts sales prices, and there's a ratio here of $1 square metre discount. Is there meant to be an actual quantity in there? Is that a typo or a mistake, or is that just intended to be generic?
On page 9, sir, at the top?
Top of the page.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's actually quite a number of tables where all of that is outlined, and I can happily provide them too if you're interested, but it was basically just to a general rule to basically say that on a square metre build cost and sale price basis, houses are generally more per square metre, but as those things work out with how much land you can amortise across more units, sometimes that works out in the favour of higher intensity and sometimes it doesn't.
So you're saying that apartments and terraces are cheaper than a house per square metre?
No, sorry, yes. So they sell at a discount, but they cost more per square metre to build. So
okay, that wasn't obvious to me.
Opposite ways to that. So it's about whether the land can be split across that or not.
Thank you.
Member Namani.
Oh, kia ora. Just a question. I'm just interested in looking at known iwi development intentions and feeding that in. Yep. I just how is that being done? Is it as simple as you're just asking?
Yeah, so we have looked on the websites of all the corporate component. We've got corporate information from the various iwi about what they're intending, so we've bundled that all together and just confirming that those are the intentions that are out in the public domain about what, yeah, so we've got some stuff around some hotels and some various developments across the region.
Yeah, I'm interested in that just because there's probably other ways too to collect that won't be sitting on their corporate websites also, and converse to that, there's probably a lot of things that are coming up. So I was just like wondering, over time, is that kind of something that you'll just look at evolving and receiving information as it comes?
Yep, yeah, absolutely. And the other thing as well is, I guess, is that the tool is, you know, if people wanted to take some land and think about what might be possible, they could kind of also do that rather than just us, you know, taking some stuff. They could use the model too, I guess. So, yep.
Okay, and is it capable of, in some of the other aspects of the information, that there might be nestled an iwi interest within a mix, say, of a housing development as an interest? Is that stuff capable of being drawn out to get into the body of getting a feel for what iwi development, how they're contributing to the market?
Yes, we can. I guess it's difficult sometimes to pick out whether a development company happens to be iwi owned or not. So your question is kind of more generic around, can we identify specific developers and what they're doing, and trying to stay away from that a little bit in terms of this kind of forecasting. But I think that's something that if they are willing to tell us, because then it becomes public, then we're happy to pass it on. But that sort of commercial sensitivity is sometimes an issue for all developers until things are actually starting to be marketed, and then they'll take any publicity they can get.
No, thank you.
Member Domini. Mayor Goff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, what stuns everybody around this table is the suggestion that in the space of a year, the number of brownfield development sites has halved. And I think my suspicion is that there's something wrong with the model here. Aren't you assuming, when you said to us that the problem comes because the increased development costs where the price of selling the land thereafter remains flat, but aren't you assuming that if the price of selling the property when you've developed remains flat or goes down, that the cost of purchasing it and the cost charged by those to develop it is going to stay high? That's not how the market works. If the cost of selling it goes down, the cost of having to buy that property, brownfields property, will also go down presumably, and those that will otherwise be struggling to find work are going to drop their prices. So how much can we rely on the model that you're putting forward?
I think you pointed out a few issues with the model, and that can be a valid response to that. We have inflated the price of development sites largely, which will be more expensive than a general site, and your point is correct in that is effectively if the ability to supply dries up, then construction costs, for example, will drop back to where they should be. So this is a snapshot in time. But also the relativity between sales prices of new things compared to a site that you can build things on will track in the same way, but a developable site is going to be worth more as a development site. And we're effectively assuming that sales prices are flat as are purchase prices, except for highly developable sites in high-end areas have increased because they're effectively scarcer than everything else.
Okay, imagining that I'm wrong and your model's right, the National Policy Statement requires that we match the supply of property with the demand for it, and you're saying, yeah, we can do that in the short term, we can do that in the medium term, but not in the long term. So what are the options for the development of further capacity that you are, say this is sustained, and I'm not sure it will be, but if it were sustained, what are the options that we would have in order to lift the level of supply?
This goes slightly to the point that Councillor Lee raised. So the NPS has a very particular focus. And so its solution would be that capacity is increased either by further upzoning of the existing brownfield area or by creating more new future urban land. That's essentially what the NPS would see as a planning response. I don't think the NPS really sees responses in terms of some of the inputs to what has caused some of this other than the planning, so some of the financial aspects of this. So if you take it in from a purely NPS perspective, you would have to upzone further. Whether that makes it more feasible at the same point in time or not is debatable, or you would have to release more land.
Yeah.
And that would be a purely NPS response.
So if I can follow that up further, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure if upzoning more brownfield land will make a difference if you're already finding that brownfield development is less capable of producing a viable result, which means that you would then look at your future urban land supply, which might give comfort to those that want to see the removal of the rub, etc. But that would blow out of the water the unitary plan goal of a 70-30 split in brownfield, greenfield subdivisions and take us closer to 50-50. So really the question that you need to be examining, or we need to be examining on your advice, is how we make that brownfield development more viable in relation to the alternative of simply developing more and more greenfield and going further and further out. So in that light, if we wanted to keep to the goal of the unitary plan of a 70-30 or even a 60-40, what steps would we need to consider taking?
Yeah. Well, I'll draw your attention to paragraph 51, which contains the feasibility results for the urban part of the area, and you can see where the feasibility threshold is lowered. You could think of that as effectively reducing the input costs by approximately the same amount, and you can see the number of feasible dwellings increases pretty sharply. The reason effectively that there's a if we drop our costs by around 10%, we're effectively more than double the amount of feasible capacity under today's costs, which gives you an idea about how tight the margins were before. So anything we can do to reduce costs and increase the speed of development is going to be helpful there.
So you're talking about dropping the costs, not the threshold?
Well, the threshold is arguably risen due to banks increasing risk adversity, ironically, to a perceived potential for house prices to drop, particularly in Australia.
So if the banks change their policy,
yeah,
that you're saying that improves the feasibility, but of course it increases the demand and pushes up the cost again, which
exactly.
which is the nature of economics.
So
I think abysmal science.
What effectively we've done is we've put a few variations on a theme there to indicate how sensitive these models are to the costs that we think developers are facing at the moment. And I guess the key issue is that if development was easy, everybody would be doing it. And in the past 12 months, things have tightened, ironically, partially due to our attempts to improve things, that supply has started to ramp up and started to consume any spare capacity that did exist in the industry. And there's other sort of global issues going on around with finance as well. So should we assume that these things are fixed and are unchangeable? Well, if we're talking about 30 years, I don't think we realistically can. Yeah. But as a starting point, we can say, well, at the moment, brownfields has probably become a lot more difficult, so we need to perhaps concentrate on enabling that. The other thing to keep in mind too is that the greenfields figure is a function of our current development contributions policy. So if we can use these tools to say, as David Norman suggests, if we increase the development contribution to less subsidy effectively for developments in those areas, we would see a significant decline in the amount of feasible development in that location, yep, which might improve the ratio, but it's not going to improve our overall numbers.
So, I'm sorry, I'll just try and wind it up, Mr. Chairman. So, if we were to have a level playing field where developers were paying the full cost of infrastructure for brownfield, but equally the full cost of development for greenfield, that would require a greater development contribution and would bring the ratio back more towards brownfield. So you're not advantaging, you're not trying to disadvantage greenfield, you're just saying you've got to pay the same cost to build a place in terms of the infrastructure that the ratepayer has to provide as somebody in a brownfield site.
Exactly, but you would induce another problem by having even less feasible development overall in the region as we'd measured it today. So,
you've got to balance those things out. But you'll come back to us early next year, looking again at the model, looking at how it's evolving, and looking at some of the options.
Yeah. So two key things. One, we need to clarify some of the detail. So I've included the narrative around some of the changes that have been made. So there is still some tweaks to be made to that. The second thing is that at the moment we're using 2014 valuations inflated by an assumed factor. We now have access to valuations across the whole city, so that will mean that individual sites will go up and down, which might make a difference. But overall, I think the figures are probably going to come out something like this. And I guess the next stage about here's some information that feeds into a process that needs to decide what to do about it. And we haven't done the work yet, so we're not really in a position to suggest what to do about it, but I'm sure there'll be plenty of opinions coming out in the next few months.
Thank you, Mr.
Maybe
Chair.
just to conclude that, what we do advise at this stage is there is no trend. The whole modelling is really new, and we don't have a proper trend yet. So our advice at this stage is do not react to a shortfall in 30 years today. Let's refine the model, let's understand this better, let's get a bit of a trend. There's no need to react immediately.
And I think to add to Jacques' point, that's exactly right. That it's only a data point on a very complex model or on a complex environment which the market reacts to. So we'll look back in a year's time and have a different view of this. So we've got some learning to do about that as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a point well made.
Thank you.
Councillor Hulse?
Thank you. And just carrying on from that, Mr. Chair, I just realised how much I've missed the discussions with Kyle on enabled and feasible and unit numbers that we got completely hooked up in what's been for years under the unitary plan. Mr. Chair, my question is just around the process. So this very critical piece of work will be the basis on which we'll discuss these issues with government, I have no doubt. Because the change in the last few weeks, we were dealing with a government that kind of understood why RUB was important, but had no interest in building houses. We now have a government that has no idea why RUB's important and wants to build houses. So we need to change the narrative in this. And the other thing I think we need to build in is the cost of our consenting process. Now, I'm not talking about the cost, in other words, how much we charge, but the cost of our consenting process, asking developers to come back and back and back, because the holding costs on those pieces of land are what are driving these to the wall. And I think we need to take a long, hard look at that. I know we're trying hard, but I'm really concerned that this is adding and exacerbating the problem. And finally, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry to talk quickly, but I have to take a call on Kauri Dai back in about a minute. I'm just hoping that we pick up the sensitivity with government around the call for. Councillor Quacks is delighted with the Labour government wanting to get rid of the RUB. I think we need to lay it on absolutely clearly the cost of the proposal by this government to remove the RUB and the fact that this will completely stall our ability to deliver on those expectations. It's dealing with cost to capital, it's keeping the construction pipeline open, and it's dealing with those other impediments out there in the building industry that need to be dealt with. And I really hope that between yourself and the Deputy Mayor, this message is delivered unequivocally. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you, Councillor. And our officials actually were talking to government officials this morning on that very thing and urban development strategy that the government would like to work on. Awesome. I think the government, we've all got some incredible challenges here, if I can just wrap this up. While some would think that it's the planning framework that's going to be the saviour for us all in delivering of housing, it's pretty clear through this report that it is not just the planning framework. We could enable feasible development all the way to the Brynderwyns and all the way to where Hamilton might meet us. But there's a certain thing about the market might have a different view. And at the moment, we've got a solid planning framework in place through the unitary plan and the future urban land supply strategy. We actually don't have a limit to the city anymore. We did away with that in the unitary plan. Seems some people forget that. We've got a soft boundary, if we call it the rural urban boundary. When you look at it and analyse it, it's actually a flexible, liquid boundary, and that land is planned to be released out of the future urban land supply strategy into the urban area in a sequenced, intelligent way as we see the triggers and see that it's necessary to be released. There is no hard and fast boundary to the metropolitan area of Auckland, if we still want to use that old language. So it's the planning framework is not the saviour here. I think what this confirms, and in fact it's on paragraph 5 on page 5 of the report, the new modelling shows principally due to rising construction costs. If you can just stop there and see what rising construction costs are doing to throttling housing supply. It's absolutely enormous. It was well signalled through the Mayoral Housing Task Force work that this has to be addressed. This was addressed in the Housing Accord in 2013 as a key area of work to be undertaken. I have to say it was not, and it was not our responsibility to address. It was a government's responsibility. Now, I'm sure the new government will see that it has a responsibility to address runaway construction costs. And you can see it well listed here in paragraph 38 on page 8 of the report. So members, I am not perturbed by this report at this stage. This report confirms that in the short term, up to 3 years, and medium term, 3 to 10, we're absolutely fine. This is the first running of this model. There should be no panic. This model will be refined. We'll get a better read on those outer years in the next time this is reported through. This model is not some clinical forecasting tool. It is far from it. If anybody thinks that, have a read again and look at why under paragraph 5 we're seeing these changes. For the first 10 years we are absolutely fine, and there is no need for any reactive measures at this time. We need to stay abreast of it. We're reading it, and our teams will continue to refine the model and to get more accurate reads. First time up, Kyle, Regan, well done. Quite detailed this, and it takes a while to get your head around. I've had to reread this report about 3 or 4 or 5 times. So thank you. Good work, Jacques. Thank you. Thanks all. We'll put that motion. All those in favour say aye. 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 Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Thanks all. I've just got one more, just on 15. Do I have a mover? Yep. Councillor Filipaino. Councillor Cooper second. Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Just check with the staff. All done? Meeting is closed. Thank you all.